As someone who's made several Titanic real-times that strive for accuracy, I always enjoy finding elements of the sinking that don't line up with others, because sometimes it can lead to a new discovery or a potential correction. So today I'm going to explain one of those little things that I've noticed and hopefully get you guys' thoughts on it. So specifically, I'm going to be looking into the survivor account by Second Officer Boxhall in Boat 2, later on in the sinking, where he claimed that by the time his boat rounded the stern, the propellers were so far out of the ocean that his boat may have potentially even went under them on their bid to try and get over to the starboard side before rowing away. The first thing to do when beginning an animation is to start out with an accurate model of the Titanic, as if you have one with an incorrect scale or an incorrect shear, it's going to result in an incorrect sinking. So I made this model using various sources, which in some instances included the original Harlan and Wolff blueprints, to try and be as accurate as possible. Officer Boxhall's testimony reportedly took place sometime around 2:05 to 2:10 a.m., right before the ship broke apart and sank. So first, we need to set the first keyframe, which is this, with the ship being at an even trim and a 2.5 degree port list, as you can see here. The moment that the plunge begins is generally accepted to be the time when the roof of the bridge began to go under the ocean surface, and that would be around 10 degrees of forward trim, and the port list is generally accepted to be around 9 degrees at this time. 10 degrees of forward trim and a port list. So now we have the beginning and the end of our animation, but we need more. It doesn't just magically all work out. You have to do a bunch of tweaking. You have to do that tweaking in order to make it accurate. Using the same concept, I'm going to run through and show you all these elements that I have done to try and make this somewhat accurate so that I can look at Mr. Boxhall's testimony. At 11:45 p.m., which is this, the ship now has a 5 degree starboard list due to the incoming ocean water from the iceberg collision. At roughly midnight, the ship now has a forward trim of roughly 1 degree. This corresponds to the mailroom flooding and other forward areas being evacuated by the crew, claiming that the ocean was flooding their sleeping spaces. At 12:15 a.m., the ship's forward trim is now roughly 2 degrees, as noted by stewardess Annie Robinson, who claimed to have seen water within 4 feet of reaching E-deck after seeing Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews returning from the mailroom. At roughly 12:25, crewman Poindexter was collecting his boots from his crew quarters on E-deck when a partition separating the crew area from third class collapsed, and he noted 3 feet of water in the crew quarters and then evacuated the room. At 12:35, just 10 minutes later, this would correspond to the ship having roughly a 3 degree angle of forward trim, as Steward Wheat saw water coming down the first class stairs of the grand staircase from E-deck to F-deck, which is generally believed to be around 12:45 to 12:50 a.m. And from here on out, we're going to move from inside survivor accounts to exterior survivor accounts. And the next major keyframe occurs at roughly 1:15 to 1:20 a.m., which is here. And this keyframe deals with lifeboat number 1, which is normally situated right here. This is the famous lifeboat during the sinking that only had around 11 or 12 people in it, 7 of which were crew members. It was the least loaded boat of the entire sinking. And there was a crew member, if I'm remembering correctly, lookout or crewman Simmons, I hope that's how you pronounce his name correctly, as they reached the water and began to pull away in a roughly this way direction. He noted that the D-deck portholes were beginning to slip under the surface, right under Titanic's nameplate. Now this keyframe is about 5 minutes after that, so if you scroll back, there that is. This corresponds to the ship having roughly a forward trim of roughly 4 degrees. And then at roughly 1:50 to 1:55 a.m., we have the lowering of boats 13 and 15. So let me just skip forward. Boats 13 and 15 were being lowered practically right on top of each other, and the condenser discharge is largely to blame for this. It was expelling water from the ship that was being pumped out, and this huge volume of water was beginning to push 13 back under boat 15. So we need to make sure that for this keyframe, the condenser discharge is at least level or above the ocean surface. It can't be below it. At around the same time on the port side, at the loading of boat 10, it was noted that the crew were having to toss women and children into the lifeboat, indicating that the ship had transitioned from a starboard to port list. Simple mathematics shows that for that to be possible, the list would need to be approximately 10 degrees. Modern computer simulations put it at 9, so I'll go with 9 for now. So adding both of those scenarios into the account, at around this time, the ship has a forward trim of around 5 degrees, and again 9 degree port list. But at what point did the ship transition from a starboard list to a port list? Well, to figure that out, we can refer to the loading of boats 11, 13, and 15. During the loading and lowering of those boats, survivors inside boat 11 noted that there was still a small list to starboard. The lowering of boats 13 and 15 had survivors mentioning that the boats were coming close to the ship's hull, which would indicate that the ship evened out sometime around the loading of boat 13 and the loading of boat 10 on the port side. Our next keyframe comes at roughly 2 a.m. when collapsible C was lowering. Surviving crew on board noted that the forecastle head was still above the ocean surface as they began to lower, but when they reached the ocean surface roughly 5 minutes later, the entire forecastle head had been submerged and the well deck was also submerged. So, one thing that I always had a problem with whenever I was animating this is it's pretty much impossible to have the entire forecastle head above the ocean surface at this time. But one thing that I had to keep in mind was the perspective of those in the lifeboats, which, if you get close, you can't really see that the forecastle head is underwater on the port side. So that was something that I had to take into account. And then finally, we have from 2:05 to 2:10 a.m. the lowering of collapsible D. 2 passengers jumped from the handrail on A deck and began to swim over to boat D as it was lowering at roughly 2:10 a.m., indicating that somewhere between 2 a.m. and 2:10 a.m. the entire forecastle deck and the forward part of B deck and A deck were beginning to submerge. The ship's forward trim between these 10 minutes is somewhere between 6 and 8 degrees of forward trim. Now, as I scroll through the entire timeline, you can see the overall movements of the ship. All the accounts coincide with each other, and each of them makes sense. None of them stand out as an anomaly. The ship isn't randomly moving up and then back down in the ocean surface is essentially what I'm trying to eliminate. I want everything to be as smooth as possible. So, now we can finally look at Mr. Boxhall. Boxhall was lowered in boat number 2, which was right here. It is the forwardmost boat on the port side. It was lowered at an approximately the same time that boats 13 and 15 were lowered on the starboard side, which means I can just easily jump to that keyframe. This is roughly 1:50 a.m., 10 minutes before collapsible C was lowered, and roughly around the same time that boat number 2 was launched as boat 13 and 15. But how long did it take the lifeboat to reach the ocean surface? To figure that out, we can use an approximation from a real-world test used by James Cameron. In the documentary Titanic 20 years later, they calculated that a lifeboat loaded down with weights took roughly 2 minutes to be lowered 10 feet, which is the approximate height of one of Titanic's decks. Or simply put, the lifeboat could be lowered 5 feet per minute. Going into our simulation, we can see that the distance from the Atlantic to boat 2 is approximately 25 feet, which would equate to just over 4 minutes to lower, or roughly, it would be around 1:54 a.m. when the boat finally touched the water. After reaching the surface, according to Boxhall, they rowed away a distance in roughly this direction for 100 feet before stopping and resting on their oars. After a couple of minutes, Captain Smith then via the megaphone called to the boats, "Bring them back, they're only half full," and to come around to the starboard gangway. So let's say that Officer Boxhall, after having reached the ocean at 1:54 to 1:55 a.m., heard this call from Captain Smith at roughly 1:56 to 1:57 a.m., after having sat still for 2 entire minutes. Boxhall has 2 options in this scenario. He can either go over the flooding bow and risk being caught in the wiring as it submerges, or he can take his boat around the stern, and he opts to go around the stern and begins ordering everyone to row. It is now approximately 1:56 a.m. and boat 2 is roughly in this location. Sometime between 2 a.m. and 2:10 a.m., this lifeboat needs to be roughly in this location for Boxhall to see the propellers above the ocean surface, and at 2:17 a.m., the time of the breakup, Boxhall and several other passengers noted that they were quite a distance away from the ship in this direction off of the starboard stern. Boxhall claims to have been around half a mile away, or 2,640 feet, nearly 3 times the length of the Titanic herself. James Johnson, also in boat 2, claims to have been a little more or less than 3/4 of a mile, or roughly 3,960 feet. So, if we give the lifeboat an estimated 2 to 3 knot speed from rowing, that equates to roughly 4 feet per second, meaning the boat could cover about 240 feet per minute. If Boxhall began pulling away from Titanic as after they rounded the stern at roughly 2:05 a.m., they would have 12 minutes until the ship broke apart, and in that time they could row 2,880 feet, assuming that the ship broke apart at 2:17 a.m. If Boxhall began to pull away from rounding the stern at 2:10 a.m., they would only have 7 minutes until the ship broke apart, and in that time, they could only row a distance of 1,680 feet. The 2:05 a.m. rowing distance lines up to what survivors estimated the distance to be, so for now, we'll be using that, meaning that we're now able to estimate that Boxhall rounded the stern at approximately 2:03 to 2:04 a.m. So now, having scrolled to that point on the timeline, we can see that the port propeller is almost entirely submerged. The central propeller is about 25% submerged, as is the starboard propeller. This doesn't line up with the sinking timeline, yet everything else up until this point has. So maybe the timing and the weighting of boat 2 are wrong. So without changing anything with the ship sinking, let's just scroll through the timeline and wait and see how long it takes until the propellers, or at least one of them, is fully out of the ocean. right there. The port propeller blade is still a little bit under. But these are well out of the ocean, as described by Boxhall. So what time is this? This is roughly 2:13 a.m. This would only give Boat 2 4 minutes to row away before the ship broke, and they would have been able to row only an approximate 960 feet in that time, which is well under those estimates that those on board gave. If we were to go back to 2:03 a.m. and change this to where the propellers are now out of the ocean, then that messes up the simulation. All of these keyframes that we put in are going to be accurate, but then the movement between these two keyframes is going to be wrong. You'll have the ship unexpectedly just rising from the ocean surface in order to make the propellers make sense. And lest we not forget, the higher you raise the propellers out of the ocean, the further down the forecastle head goes. So that can't be right. So what did happen? Did Boxhall see the propellers out of the ocean and possibly pass under them, as he claimed? Did he see something else that he thought were propellers? What could he have seen? Or does that mean that one of the pre-established timeline elements is incorrect? It's universally agreed that Titanic sank at around 2:20 a.m. But what if we also think of that time as an estimate? What if, with the bridge submerging at 2:15 a.m. and Boxhall rounding the stern at 2:13 a.m., what if he began to pull away then? How long would it take Boxhall's boat to reach approximately half a mile, or 2,600 feet? We can figure that out with simple math. So let's say that Boxhall's course would take him roughly around here, and then he passed under, and then he was approximately right here when he began to pull away, and he would be going in roughly this direction. With an approximate rowing speed of 240 feet per minute and a distance of 2,600 feet, we can use division to get roughly a time of 10.8 minutes, putting the time that Titanic sank fully, not broke, but fully sank at roughly 2:23 a.m. So take a minute to stop and think here. How often in your life has someone asked you, what time is it? Hey, do you got the time? And how often have you rounded to the nearest minute, or the nearest 5 minutes, or the nearest 10 minutes? This may have been what survivors were doing with the sinking, if this timeline is actually close to what happened. It's also possible that those that did have watches didn't have them set correctly, so they were waiting for morning to set them according to the ship's clocks. So using this alteration, we can make everything line up with each other. But it goes against something that people have believed in for over 100 years, meaning that the ship didn't sink at 2:20, but 2:23. So what did happen? Was Boxhall mistaken? Is the animation file wrong? But how can it be when everything else lines up and makes sense? Did Boxhall actually see the propellers and go under them? Or was he mistaken? Or is it just a fabricated story? Who knows? What are your thoughts?